Welcome to the shortened edit of the Adaptation panel that I moderated during COP26 in Glasgow with Pooran Desai. On the panel we had Professor Alice Hill and Professor Sir David King, as well as Namibian Fridays for Future activist Jakapita Kandanga, as well as Professor Kevin Anderson. In this session we are focused largely on the UK, USA and Namibia and delve into the complexity of social change, education, building resilience in our cities, and how the global middle classes have an obligation to consume less and lead by example as millions more are lifted out of poverty and seek that example. Other subjects such as greenhouse gas removal, electrification and the role of nuclear also enter the discussion. We are very grateful to such an engaged audience and also to the panel and partners who made this happen. The unedited film version is on my YouTube channel, which you can find at Nick Bree's Climate Gen. There are also 2 more COP26 focused podcasts to upload in the next couple of days, which I think offer unique insights. I will also be recording the next round of forward-looking interviews with special guests starting this week. Please do subscribe on all the main channels, including YouTube, where these can be watched. You can also support my work via Patreon or subscribe at genn.cc. Links are all in the notes. Thank you very much. Now we're going to go straight to Sir Dave. Can you tell us what the sort of climate signal, the distress signal that you're seeing as the kind of the reality of the climate system that seems to be catching up with the ambition of the COP process?
I think the event that signals the difficulties that we're all in today is the melting of ice over the North Pole. Now, there is one person sitting here who was aware of this many, many years ago, and he was a voice in the wilderness. Peter Wadhams. Peter, do stand up and take credit for measuring the thickness of ice. How was he measuring the thickness of ice? He was traveling in nuclear submarines under the water and measuring the thickness above him. Only person we know of who traveled in all 3 countries' nuclear submarines. In other words, Soviet Union as it was then, Britain and America. So, he took every opportunity to keep measuring. And the ice was thinning with a positive feedback. And the result of that exposure of the blue Arctic Ocean means that during those 3 polar months, when the sun in midsummer is shining over the North Pole for 24 hours a day, the temperature is now unbelievably warm. On the Climate Crisis Advisory Group, we got 15 people from 11 countries. One of them, Tero Mustonen, is a representative of the Sami and Inuit people who live on the permafrost. And as he would say, and we've lived here for thousands of years. I spoke to Tero, he's a climate scientist. I spoke to, and a reindeer herder, of course. I spoke to him in May this year. What's the temperature like? We were just chatting. He said, it's cold. It's -30. But he said, don't worry. We know how to live on this. I spoke to him at the end of July. He was in tears. He said, you're not going to believe this. The temperature's +32 degrees centigrade. He said, in front of me, quite a distance away, is a boreal forest that's always been there. He said, it's on fire. We've had lightning strikes for the first time ever. So the temperature change in that vicinity means the North Pole is now one of the warmest regions in the Northern Hemisphere during that 3-month period. The hot air above that blue sea is what's causing this. And the follow through from this, I don't want to take too much time, but the follow through from this is threefold, and the whole planet is impacted by this. The first is there sitting in that blue sea during the Arctic polar summer is Greenland. As Greenland ice is now melting also with a positive feedback, sea levels will rise by 7.5 meters. I'm talking about the global average sea level rise. The map of the world dramatically changed. How long will it take? Well, it may take several hundred years, but even if we get to 0.5 meter sea level rise, let me give you a prediction that's been made by a group of climate scientists fairly recently on the country of Vietnam, which is a country that the Mekong River has created this big delta, And the whole country is basically silt brought down over many thousands of years. It's very close to sea level. Vietnam underwater, under seawater, 95% of the landmass of the country under seawater in just 30 years' time. So these are the predictions that emerge from the irreversible, unless we can step in and change this, irreversible loss of ice on land around the world, eventually leading to a sea level rise of 20 meters. That's on the cards now. It may take 1,000 years, but we can look back 3,000 years. Apparently, we can't look forward more than 100. But the second thing is that in that permafrost is a vast amount of methane. And methane release is now happening explosively, creating big craters, 50 meters diameter, 60 meters deep. And about 1,000 of these craters have now been formed. There's enough methane there that as the permafrost melts, global temperatures will rise 20 degrees centigrade. We're looking at a different world, which is already now happening. And we need to step in and attempt, and this is what we're trying to do at Cambridge, working globally with other partners, attempting to buy time by refreezing the Arctic, and then attempting also to see if we can remove greenhouse gases to bring them down to 350 parts per million. And frankly, unless we do these things, we're cooked. Thank you.
Okay, that's a stark ending. I'm going to move on to Alice, because we seem to be now in the sort of decade of consequences. The rhetoric's sort of exhausted. In your book, you talk about things that we need to do right across the world to adapt and make it a key thing. How do you mobilize, with your experience of the inner workings of the US state, which is probably the best example we could have, how do you mobilize the pragmatic actions that you outline in your book? And perhaps you could give an example.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. As you've heard, the climate is changing, and it's changing quickly. We have lots of built stuff that has all been built on the assumption that our climate is stable. That is now a poor assumption. The past can no longer guide us. So if you look at the built environment in Glasgow, where I live, Washington, D.C., pretty much every decision that has been made has assumed that the extreme events of the past, the highest winds, the highest heat, the flooding levels are what we will encounter in the future. That turns out to be a big challenge for us. Our building codes, pretty much across the globe, which are the building codes are what keep us safe in our buildings, and they are what allow the buildings to survive a bad event. Those building codes are based on historical data. They do not yet include future data. So any infrastructure we're putting up now, unless there's a very involved engineer or a concerned owner, is built for what's in the past. This is a critical moment as we need to spend more to cut our emissions to avoid the very worst, but we also need to make sure that we're making smart decisions. And to get to your question, how do we do that? Well, first of all, we need broader recognition that it's smart to invest in risk reduction. The studies in the United States show that for every dollar we spend on risk reduction, we save about $11 in damages. And if we don't save a community, we see really cascading economic impacts that are not reflected in the economic modeling. I'll give you an example. In 2017 and 18, we had devastating wildfires in California. The town of Paradise, a lower middle class town in the mountains of California, burned to the ground. 8 people died, and 20,000 people overnight were thrown into another adjoining town called Chico, California. Chico already suffered from affordable housing challenges, and suddenly 20,000 people appear with kindergartners who need to get enrolled in school, people looking for jobs, people looking for a place to live. Highly difficult situation for both those that have been displaced and the receiving communities. but the modeling doesn't really pick up beyond that economic dislocation to what else happened. Turned out that the fires got so hot that the piping underneath Paradise melted, perhaps spreading toxic chemicals to the water supply. We then saw that the wildfire smoke caused health implications, increased asthma, increased respiratory disease, including all the way over to where I live in Washington, D.C. The smoke was that bad. And now we are having a atmospheric river has dumped a lot of rain on California. And we're seeing mudslides because that very scarred area with intense heat from these wildfires that burn hotter makes the land so tough that the water, when it hits, just hits it and picks up boulders and everything else. And we have our reservoirs in the mountains in California threatening our freshwater supplies. So the lesson of all this is we need to invest now in thinking through what are the ramifications from climate change and make better decisions right now. In my opinion, this won't happen unless governments are deeply involved. It's simply the bottom line on the cost-benefit analysis, unless you include the future gains, which may be in 10 years or 20 years. It gets cut on the cutting room floor, and we don't build the bridge high enough for the types of rains and flooding we'll see, or we may put the bridge in the wrong place where there won't be land anymore. Very difficult problem, but we do have some good examples in response to flooding in the United States after Superstorm Sandy. I led the development of our first ever national building code for flooding. It requires elevation of buildings just to have the water wash through. President Trump, 10 days before Hurricane Harvey dumped about over a meter worth of rain right onto Houston, which is pancake flat and mostly asphalt, massive flooding there. He had revoked that building code. President Biden has now returned that building code. And that's what we will need to see going forward is nations stepping in and insisting that where public money is spent, it's spent resiliently, because we simply can't afford to sort of follow the laissez-faire approach that we had in the past, because the tool set we have right now hasn't caught up to the risks that we know are in our future. So that is the most important lesson for all of us. Don't assume that the past can guide us anymore. And then are the decisions that you're relying on, are they reflecting that assumption that the past is guiding us, or are they future focused? So thanks.
Okay. And there is you talked about Trump and Biden there, and there's a chapter in your book which is Leadership Matters. And in the context of the COP, and especially, I think it's fair to say, the UK, I mean, it is a really poignant chapter to read. So I'm going to go to Jakapita. You've come from Namibia, which is a frontline climate impact nation. Can you tell us the story that you've brought to Glasgow from Namibia?
Thank you, Nick. Basically, just to give like a bit of background about Namibia. Namibia is a very semi-arid area. It's in Southern Africa. And basically what we suffer from, like in terms of climate, we have a persistent drought, water scarcity, and we really lack like fresh water in Namibia. So basically for the past years, another thing about Namibia is also that we have a very high unemployment rate, which means that over 70% of the country's population, they depend on agriculture and farming. And because of the climate crisis that has been going on, the persistent drought and the water scarcity, it's been really difficult for people to survive. And most of the people have been losing their cattle, which has led to a lot of people living in poverty. One of the threats that we recently received is oil drilling in the Okavango Delta. The Okavango Delta is one of Namibia's freshest water points. Like that's where most of our fresh water comes from. So we have a country from Canada, a company from Canada called Recon Africa, and they assume that there might be oil in the Okavango Delta. So they've been trying to drill for oil in that area. And the way that it has been, the way they have been doing it from the beginning was wrong, because the country's population, we were not informed. Everything was done behind closed doors. And by the time we realized what was going on, Recon Africa was already on its way to Namibia. So it was a bit too late to do anything about it. As we speak, they are already in the Okavango Delta. Due to that, a lot of people have been misplaced from their ancestral lands and so forth. And us as Namibian youth activists, when we tried to speak up about it, we were called hooligans and idiots by our government, by our president to be specific, because they accused us of trying to stop the country's development. Honestly, I just came here to COP because I felt that my government was not doing enough to protect its people. I feel like my government is like greedy and they're trying to put profits over people. I mean, we already do not have water, and the little water that we have, they're trying to drill for oil. And Recon Africa is only willing to give Namibia about 10% of the profits from the oil drilling, which really does not benefit Namibia much. So that is basically why I'm here.
And of course, again, leadership misused or abused. So yeah, thank you for telling that. Kevin, can we recap on where we are at COP26? You're closely sort of monitoring things. Do you see signals that there might be a bend in the emissions curve? And are we right to start talking about adaptation from your point of view?
We're absolutely right to be talking about adaptation, and we should have been talking about it for the last 30 years. Am I seeing any sign that we're going to bend the emissions curve? Well, the rhetoric's been ramped up, but no, I don't think we're likely to bend the emissions curve unless we're hit by another pandemic. But I mean, look at the growth we're seeing in carbon dioxide emissions this year. It could be one of the highest that we've ever seen in modern times. So I'm not saying any positive signs, or very few positive signs from the formal side, you know, the blue zone of COP. If I look for any hope, I actually see it coming much more from the youth movements, the civil society groups, the places where you wouldn't really normally expect to see leadership. Leadership is not being demonstrated top down. It's not been demonstrated by and large by the senior academics. It's been completely abdicated by the journalists. I would argue that civil society and some of the youth movements are much, their demands are much more in line with what the science is calling for than the scientists themselves are prepared to say in relation to their own work. Not all scientists, but by and large, the scientists are to a degree, I think, mitigation deniers on this, and obviously not in relation to climate change science, but in terms of what we need to do about it. How's that captured? I think, and I don't mean to pick on that particular poster over there. To me, this is why COP26 is bound to fail. The two words at the top: net zero. Net zero. There was no reference to net zero in the assessment report 5, the IPCC. It's all over assessment report 6. The Committee on Climate Change in the UK, its 5th budget report 5 years ago, wasn't mentioned once. In its 6th budget report, that same phrase is used between 3,000 and 5,000 times. We use that word, that expression now, and anything fits into it. Saudi Arabia, net zero. BP, net zero. Shell, net zero. Every country basically aims at net zero. It has undermined the need for immediate and pressing action through a whole set of things that net zero captures. And it's really a requirement, I think, of a lot of us academics to pore over the spreadsheets that underpin the statements, if those spreadsheets exist at all, the net zero statements we hear in COP. So we look at India, comes out net zero 2070. There's nothing behind that. That's just an announcement pulled out the air at the last minute. But then you look at China, net zero 2060 and peaking emissions by 2026 to 2030. Just look at the emissions under that pathway. That blows 1.5 virtually out of the water. But then you come to the US, lots of grand talk, but its emissions per capita remain incredibly high for years to come, and it's not prepared to tackle the real challenges that climate change throws up on us. But then you go to the UK, you know, colonial as ever, we're the world leader on climate change, 44% reduction since 1990, except for that excludes aviation and shipping emissions, and it also excludes our imports and exports. Then it's a 15% reduction since 1990, 0.5% a year. Much of that driven by reductions in coal, which are driven by the EU legislation on sulfur, not climate change. You unpick the rhetoric And what you find underneath it is just a vacuous, empty space. And that's what we're seeing here. And until we are prepared to grasp the nettle and recognize that the climate and the temperature responds to physics, chemistry, and biology, not ephemeral economics, not short-term politics, then we are going to continue to fail. And who are we failing? I'm hoping to be here in 2050 with a bit of stem cell research, but we're really, we're really sort of, we're failing you, your communities. We're failing a lot of the young communities here. We're failing other species as well. And I think unless we are going to very rapidly, grasp the nettle, and we will not do it with our current leaders. They are not up to the job. They are ill-equipped and unable to understand the challenges that we face. Now, they may be pushed into making some decisions appropriately, but they will not be pushed through their own understanding of the issues. The rest of us have a job to play. Leadership is a partnership between bottom up and top down. And at the moment, the top down part is failing. But that partnership is always messy, but it's absolutely key. The marchers, the youth movements, the civil society groups are a key part of leadership. I think we need to unpick this top-down view of leadership and start to view it as much more a messy and difficult partnership that we always inevitably have. Am I saying hope? Really, that hope, if it resides anywhere, it resides in the communities that we see outside the blue zone. And really, those communities and those voices need to be heard within the blue zone if we're going to make any real success.
So I'm Claire Wildfire from Mott MacDonald, and my role is Global Practice Leader for Cities. So I'm going to ask a cities-related question, probably to Alice and Kevin, which is, where do you see the role of the city leaders? Because they sit midway between the bottom-up and the top-down, and we see quite a lot of movement and discussion from them, but not as much of a discussion in the blue zone as one might have expected. So be interested in your observations. Thank you.
I think your point is really well taken. Cities have been far more visible in recent years in the United States during the years of President Trump announcing that climate change was a hoax. We saw mayors from across the United States join in efforts to indicate that they were still in for the Paris Agreement, and they were working hard to reduce emissions in their cities as well as build resilience. In the area I focus on, it is tricky for the mayors with resilience because resilience at its core also requires land use decisions. That means that sometimes you have to say it's not wise to build that building right next to the river or right next to the coastline. But for the mayor, that is a huge tax source, at least in the United States, could be very expensive real estate. And it turns out most of us want to live near water, and that property is incredibly valuable. So we do see a tension there in the choices as to resilience. So for example, in the state of New Jersey, in the last 10 years or so, we've seen more development at risk of flooding than development not at risk. And that's a paradigm we need to examine more closely. I do want to just add one additional point on the question about Africa. It raised the migration issue. I do focus on national security and climate change, and I would say here at the COP, for the very first time, that topic was featured. The General Secretary of NATO appeared and stated that his strategy for NATO is now examining the global security risks posed by climate change. They're enormous. As we see water availability reduced, food insecurity increased, that all adds to the risk of conflict. Climate change is a crisis multiplier, a threat multiplier, and the numbers of people predicted to be on the move, just as I described that small example in a wealthy nation like the United States. But as we see people who are survival migrants, they're not climate refugees. They are looking for food. They're hungry. They need livelihoods. They need to be able to educate their children. As people are on the move, initially within their borders, but then they will leave and go outside their borders. That's highly challenging for the people involved, the communities receiving them, and the communities that are having massive numbers of people leave. So this will undermine global security, and it's an issue that is of growing interest, I know, in the United States, our Department of Defense, UK Secretary of Defense, or I'm not sure if that's the right term, Ben Wallace was here also talking about this. It's an issue that we will see grow in importance as the impacts have accelerated and continue to challenge really every community across the planet. So thanks for the opportunity to answer the question.
Okay, Kevin, would you like to respond?
Well, on the cities question, colleagues of mine at the Tyndall Centre have been working quite closely with cities, mostly in the UK, and we've worked now with a number of other European cities. And it just seemed to me that certainly there are some mayors, not all, there are some mayors, there are some city councils that are well ahead of their national governments in terms of at least trying to frame the climate agenda. They're not as far as I think the science requires, or indeed the civil society movements are requesting, but they're somewhere between the two. I think the problem for a lot of them is actually what powers they have. So they have very limited powers. I mean, their powers sort of traditionally have just been the things that they can directly control in relation to council activities, which are a very small part, of course, of the source of emissions within the city. So there has to be some mechanism by which councils can start to put things in place, and mayors put things in place that impact every facet, the private sector, all facets, all the institutions within their city boundaries, and also recognizing that, of course, the boundaries are quite artificial. You know, cities don't work in isolation from the rural community. It's just a convenient construct. Yeah, you know, we work across those boundaries. So we have to be, those boundary issues can be really quite important things, and we mustn't exacerbate tensions between rural communities and cities by not thinking about those boundary conditions. And I know that is happening already in quite a few European cities, that tension. I think the cities need to be framing their thinking on climate change in relation to, yeah, let's reduce emissions, let's aim for 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade, ideally 1.5, but let's plan for 4. Let's plan our infrastructure for the regional impacts of a global change of about 4 degrees. So that's the sort of direction that we're broadly pointing in. That will, of course, mean that any CBA, any cost-benefit analysis you do is going to be very challenging. I don't particularly like cost-benefit analysis anyway, but because you're going to have to think, well, what the costs of putting infrastructure in for 4 degrees centigrade is far more expensive than putting it in for 2 degrees centigrade. But if you put it in for 2 degrees centigrade, then you get hit by 4, then you've maladapted the future. And that's also very important for some of the countries that are developing their city infrastructures now. You know, do not follow examples of the West. You know, put the infrastructure in that is suitable for a very, very different climate from the one you've got today. And the final bit on cities, and it's true across the board, I should have made that comment before, is the issue of equity. Equity between countries, but also equity within countries. And this is always the elephant in the room. And that's because who are the people that lead the climate change agenda? The climate scientists and academics, the barristers, the policymakers, the entrepreneurs, all of those in the top 1% of global emitters. So we never, ever talk about equity. You know, the recent report from Oxfam, or the previous work from Chanson and Piketty, or the wonderful work from Julia Steinberg and others academically pointing out that half of global emissions come from 10% of the population. The top 1% of emitters are responsible for twice as much as the bottom 50%. Just imagine that number. The top 1% of global emitters are responsible for twice as much as half of the global population. How many of us here, how many of us in this room today are in that top 1%? And this is the problem for the mayors. They're not prepared yet to grasp this equity issue. And I think that is also key. We're not all in this together. There are very different elements to it, sort of split up by our socioeconomics. But that's the elephant in the room. We're not prepared to talk about those issues. So I think the mayors need to grasp the equity implications within the cities that they often are in control of, where you will see huge disparities between the rich and the poor parts. Go to Bearsden in Glasgow, then go to Drumchapel. I think the average life expectancy for males is 30 years different between the two. You know where the high emitters are? They're all out in Bearsden.
Dave, I know you've been interfacing with the C14 mayors, and also, what did you think of Kevin's point of prepare for 4, even if you're aiming for 1.5, 2?
I'm one of those many people who admires Kevin, but we've been operating in very different spheres. And so you may pick us up from my response. So the first thing is I traveled up on the train from London with the C40 group. I was the entertainment on the train for the mayors. And I actually rather admire what they're doing. It is relatively limited because they, as Kevin says, have got restrictions placed by government policies, etc. But the exchange of best practice in that group is a key factor of how they're operating. So the mayor of Barcelona, who's been mayor for more than 15 years and has transformed that city. If you visit Barcelona today and haven't been there for the past 15 years, it's like a totally different city. And it's reaching all of these very good marks from around the world on environmental protection. So I think we mustn't lose sight of the importance of the spread of best practice. And what I also want to say is, yeah, the global leaders, I totally agree with the comments that have been made about the poor leadership we currently have on all of these critical issues. But I think we've got to look for coalitions of willing countries, coalitions of willing cities, coalitions of willing people. Don't believe that everything happens at that global level. There is so much that one can point to where advances have been made through international cooperation. When the thought was there that Trump would run for another term, I was talking to the groups of willing states in the United States who were talking about forming a collaboration group for true action on climate change. So action can occur at all sorts of levels. Now, one comment I do want to make about best practice. Kevin's taken an easy shot at the way the UK has switched away, for example, from coal usage. And I just want to say, Kevin, sorry, you're wrong. That was nothing to do with sulfur in coal. Nothing to do with it. I was sitting there running this program from in government. And what we were trying to do was to see how we could create incentives or obligations to drive through the process with each of the utilities to move away from fossil fuel usage. The result of this, and by the way, we picked it up from Germany. We didn't develop this ourselves. Germany developed feed-in tariffs, believe it or not, in 1989 to encourage all of the utilities and individuals to switch away from fossil fuels. Now, the net result of this is that we, having begun the Industrial Revolution on coal, we now no longer use coal for electricity production. Yes, we've got a big step up in gas dependence, but there's now a commitment drawn in place by the Parliamentary Committee on Climate Change. It's a parliamentary committee unlike any other in the world, where we reached all-party agreement, because this is a long-range program. And it's the Climate Change Committee on Parliament who gave the Prime Minister that figure: we will have reduced our emissions by 78% by 2035. Now, that's a figure that he boasted we would deliver at the G7 meeting this year. Now, we don't have a Prime Minister that seems to be focused on this. Let me just fully agree with anyone who wants to criticize our current leadership. But the important thing is, we mustn't just disregard best practice. If I just look, and this is a critical factor for the whole world, feed-in tariffs introduced in Germany, then in Britain, then across in Spain, Italy, France, etc., Europe and California, feed-in tariffs and their equivalent have meant that renewable energy systems are now cheaper for most of the world than any other. When they were first introduced, they were 30 or 40 times more expensive. Right? So by artificially creating a market, we have created a market for the whole world. Now, there is massive problems around the world where there's a belief that fossil fuels is the only way forward. And I do want to say, we can persuade South Africa, we can persuade India to stop using coal. These are the problems of countries that produce coal and have a large number of coal miners. Retrain your coal miners in South Africa, for example. Use the deserts in the Kalahari, in Namibia, to create renewable energy systems. These systems will be cheaper than installing new coal-fired power stations. Now, let's not just rule out any advances that have been made. We have to give credit where credit is due.
Hi, Paul Behrens from Leiden University, and I would just add on that last point. Renewables are highly adaptable to. You can move them around a lot easier. Offshore wind, for example, can actually reduce onshore storm events in Europe. So, in fact, they can both mitigate some of the harm, which is really interesting. But to the point about the impacts here, I think there's a lot of discussion about average temperatures and things, and you're quite lucidly described the catastrophic sort of impacts that are already built in by the shifting energy system. And when you talk about the coalition of the willing, how do you get that willingness ahead to pay that $1 for the $11 later, that they actually believe it in their hearts? And you see a real sort of pushback in the communication at the moment. We don't want doomism. We don't want this sort of thing. We don't want the sort of negatives. We want to be focusing on hope. In my experience, you need that sort of switch to happen in order for people to actually want to spend that dollar. So how do you balance this in your communication and how you speak about the challenges coming ahead for adaptation? Thank you.
Put a very quick answer in there. It is, for example, we haven't yet seen the losses in the reinsurance sector this year around the Northern Hemisphere in particular from the extreme weather events, the super extreme weather events. 5 degrees, 10 degrees centigrade higher temperatures than ever observed in many parts of the world. Watch the losses made by the reinsurance sector. They haven't yet declared their losses for this past summer. That's going to hit them where that 1 in $11 really does matter.
Alice, yeah.
Well, on the insurance point, we are close to a crisis in the United States with property and casualty insurance for wildfire. California is the 4th largest insurance market in the world, so insurers want to operate there. But for the fires in 2017 and 18 wiped out almost a quarter century worth of profit for the insurers insuring for wildfire. So at this point, some insurers have said we don't want to insure property in areas that we know are at high fire risk. Our regulator has stepped in and said to the insurers, you can't leave. If you want to do business in California, you're going to have to offer renewals to homeowners so that they can continue to get insurance. We've been doing this for several years. What will happen is eventually this will even become too big for the reinsurers. The president of, or the CEO of AXA has said a 3 to 4 degree world is uninsurable for property and casualty insurance. There are many other risks to insure. It's not that insurance companies will disappear. It's just for these acute events. So it does make it very difficult to see how we will drive that investment. I think the one way that is probably the most vivid to me, it's expensive, but it's deep engagement with communities. And we have one example of that in the United States. In the state of Louisiana, you may recall that along our Gulf Coast, it was hit with the BP oil spill. As a result of that oil spill, the state got a fair amount of money. It decided to use that money to engage with a number of equivalent of counties in that area. They had thousands of meetings. This is a deeply red, deeply Republican area in the United States where climate change isn't particularly welcome discussion. But through those meetings, those counties got to plans where they actually identified the land that would disappear as a result of sea level rise and subsidence. They're losing about a football field an hour of land in Louisiana, so it's important they figure out which communities will survive. Through that planning process, they were able to identify who's going to have to move. Extraordinary. We don't see that in most of the rest of the United States. Most people are dug in. I'm not moving. I'm going to die in this house, whatever they say. But this is an important step. And what it taught me is we need to meet the communities where they are, hear their concerns, hear from those affected. It takes time, it takes money, but without it, it's going to be hugely contentious to figure out these choices we need to make going forward.
Unfortunately, Salim Al-Haq couldn't join us here today, but his key message about adaptation in Bangladesh is that it's awareness amongst citizens that is the key way that we can adapt and we can build that resilience. And I think, Alice, that reflects what you're saying. So I think one of the things we have to look forward to now is really how do we build that awareness amongst people at at the level that we need to people need to understand the seriousness of the situation. It does look as though we're starting to cross certain tipping points with our climate, but they're social tipping points as well, and they're technological tipping points, they're economic tipping points. So can we facilitate and accelerate those tipping points, which will put us in a better place? And I wonder whether that's how we start really creating a story to get us out of this predicament. Because if we just face the facts as they are today, with the predictions of where we're going, we are in trouble. So how do we change really the story that we tell ourselves about our future? And, what has made human beings uniquely successful as a species is our ability to cooperate. And we are a storytelling species. What is the story that we tell ourselves at the moment about ourselves, about our past, and about our future? And how can we turn that story into one where we actually have the ability to dream again?
Just quickly to touch on the insurance issue that Alice and David pointed out. And the insurance issue we often talk about, $1 trillion issues. And then you think about loss and damage. That's the insurance for Namibia. That's the insurance for the poorer parts of the world. And it's pennies. 100 billion we're talking about at the moment, and we can't even be bothered to dip in our pockets for that. 100 billion, that's 1/20th of the UK's GDP. That's what the rich countries are going to put into the poor countries each year, 1/20th of the UK GDP. Von der Leyen, her leader speech here from the EU, said the EU is doing well, it's putting 27 billion into this. 27 billion is 0.2% of the 16 trillion GDP for the EU. So when we talk about insurance, let's not just worry about our wealthy homes in the wealthy parts of the UK or in the US. Let's think about the poor parts of the world who are suffering the implications from our ongoing and known implications, I should add, of our ongoing choice not to reduce our emissions for the last 30 years since the first IPCC report. Loss and damage is the insurance for other parts of the world, and we treat it with complete disrespect so far. So I think we need to marry that insurance issue up between the rich countries, also with the poor countries, which means we need to be putting tens of trillions into the poor countries, not a crumb that falls off the table called 100 billion, which you then can't even be bothered to pay.
Jakapita.
I just wanted to add on 2 points. First, it was the insurance that we African countries we get from the European countries. Yes, that money is invested into African countries and so, but then at the end of the day, you put money into African countries for them to be able to cope with the climate crisis, but then that money never really reaches the people it's supposed to reach because our governments at the top, they are not doing their jobs properly. So at the end of the day, you can invest how much into an African country to combat climate crisis, but as long as you are not doing a follow-up on how that money was used in that specific country, you are really not helping. So it is like, I do appreciate that money is sent, but at the end of the day, if you do not follow up, if the people really impacted by the climate change are really benefiting from this money, and then it is like a bit useless for us at the bottom of the climate crisis. Another thing is the awareness. Someone did mention awareness. I don't think that a lot of people, especially from Namibia, understand what the climate crisis is. They live the climate crisis every day. They do feel it, but they do not understand because they are not aware and they are not educated. The gap between our government and the people at the bottom is way too big. I mean, our government comes to, they attend COP, and they make all these policies at COP. They all sign these agreements, but then when they go back to Namibia, they go do quite the opposite and they contradict their own policies. For example, is that our government did sign the Paris Agreement that included the reduction of carbon emissions, right? But then at the same time, they're trying to invest in oil drilling, you understand? So I feel like the people in Namibia, the people at the bottom, they do not know what the climate crisis is. You come to them, you talk about the climate crisis, and they do not understand. They blame God for what is happening. They do not blame, they do not blame like countries or companies that give out all these emissions. They blame God because they do not understand. So I feel like a lot of attention should be given to creating awareness to what the climate crisis is, and then maybe people will be able to better adapt to the climate crisis if they actually know what is going on.
We've heard a lot about emissions reductions, and we've heard a lot here about emissions reductions, and everybody feels and knows that's a good thing, that we must reduce emissions as much as we possibly can. But if all we do is reduce emissions, then the climate will keep getting warmer. It doesn't matter how much we reduce them by, so long as they're non-zero and we don't do anything else, the climate will keep getting warmer. It's already too warm. So most people recognize this, but many people feel, well, we have to do something beyond that, which is actually take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And that's the only way to bring the climate into a more reasonable state. And if we do that, that could become and could easily become the most important financial commitment that the world makes, because the techniques of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere or out of the ocean, which is equivalent, would be very, very large. It would be a major global effort, more powerful and more important, and probably more valuable than simply reducing our emissions by bits and pieces as we're doing. Instead, let's make a very serious decision that we're going to take carbon out of the atmosphere and do whatever it needs in terms of engineering and science to be able to make that step.
Hi, my name is Fiona Ormiston. I'm an actor, artist, activist, you could say. And I guess this is a question for Alice, because I know that the United States is a big pusher for nuclear energy. So with this big push on electric cars, where's the energy going to come from to charge them? The nuclear industry sells itself as a green energy, and it's not green with the waste that comes from these plants. Why are the governments not decommissioning the old nuclear plants and putting money into renewable energy, which is cheaper? And have we not learned lessons from Chernobyl and Fukushima? The other question I have is for you, Sir David. With all your wealth and knowledge and experience, how do you see the future unfolding when corporations who fund politicians and scientists are still having the last say on issues concerning the climate?
Quick answer on the nuclear. Yes, in the United States, the federal government does view nuclear as part of the solution, probably small nuclear reactors. I would say that there's a caveat for all of us as we discuss nuclear power. Most of our fleet across the globe was built in the 1970s and 1980s before there was any concern for climate impacts. We know that those climate impacts can undermine and threaten the operation. You referenced Fukushima, but they require cool waters to cool the plants. And in Connecticut, we have seen plants have to shut down because the temperatures of the cooling waters, the bay that's next to the plant, got too warm. So they had to shut down operations. In our Western United States, we've seen fires threaten a nuclear research facility as well as a nuclear plant. There's currently no scheme internationally to look at decisions made by sovereign states to extend the operating license for nuclear plants. And you may hear, let's just keep it running. We already have this nuclear plant, it's safe. But until this issue is one that's resolved to determine what are the impacts, there are huge risks in considering to authorize operation of plants that were built in the 1970s and 80s that just don't account for the temperatures, the flooding, the drought, and the wildfires that we're already seeing.
Kevin, do you want to say a couple of words on viability and risk of nuclear?
Well, both those questions are the sort of thing I work on most of the time, the negative emissions as well. I was just on the negative emission technologies and these ways to remove the CO2 from the atmosphere, and even perhaps some of the other geoengineering techniques. I'm all in favour of us doing the research and development on those. And if they meet stringent sustainability criteria, and that includes issues of social criteria as well as just environmental criteria, then yeah, let's try and deploy them. But only if they meet those criteria. the prospect of that, we don't have those, but the prospect of that is already being used today to undermine the mitigation policies we're putting in place. So the reason that we are in the UK able to have the new Cambo oil field, to expand our airports, to have £27 billion on new roads, to spend £1 billion on a new massive gas field in Mozambique from the UK taxpayers, thank you very much. And the reason we can do that is because we're relying on negative emissions after 2050 to suck the CO2 out of the air. So let's do the research, but let's not use that to undermine what we're doing today. I saw David shaking his head that it was true or not, but I unpick the spreadsheets underpinning the UK policies. Look at the numbers that are actually in the spreadsheets from the government, and you can see that actually happening in the numbers there. And the UK has a much more developed framework to understand these issues than most other countries. On nuclear, just to be clear, nuclear is very low carbon. Its life cycle emissions are roughly the same as the renewables, very roughly. So somewhere between 5 and 15 to 20 grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour, compared with 450 for gas and 900 for coal. It provides about 4% of UK's final energy demand. Careful, of final energy demand. It provides 2.5% of global final energy demand. There are 450 nuclear power stations around the world. If you want nuclear to play a major role, say 25% of current global energy demand, you'd need about another 2,000 to 4,000 size world B nuclear reactors. That's like UK's largest reactor at the moment. 2,000 to 5 to 4,000. Build them in 20 years and, okay, it can make a dent to 25% of UK energy demand. The numbers matter. What you often get from people on all these things is nebulous arm waving. They don't look at the numbers. When you play out the numbers, you often get quite different conclusions. So I'm not opposed to nuclear. I'm agnostic about it. It is low carbon, but to assume you can do a huge amount with it, I think is overplaying perhaps what it can deliver. But that's a question still to be asked. I wouldn't be closing down existing stations if you can keep them running, not unless you've got a very, very high levels of renewables to replace them, which we haven't. And just to put one last set of numbers that are quite important on this, I think, the arguments can simply be made for renewables. The UK has this policy, and a lot of people are really positive about this, of 40 gigawatts of wind by 2030 and 100 gigawatts of wind by 2050. That sounds hugely impressive. Multiply it by 8,760, and then multiply that by 0.45, and that'll tell you how much energy you'll get out of those wind turbines every year. Just a bit of basic arithmetic. And that by 2030, 10% of UK energy demand will come from wind. Where's the other 90% coming from to be zero carbon? By 2050, according to government figures, 100 gigawatts, that gives you about 25% of energy demand met by wind. Where's the other 75% coming from? We have to start to look at these things in the round, and it requires us to do some maths rather than just grand statements. And when you do the maths, you end up with something that looks very different from when you just make the statements.
So the first thing I would say is that I too am agnostic about nuclear. I think it is low carbon, has that major advantage. I do agree with Kevin. It's never going to be the global solution. And the global solution is straightforwardly renewables. The direct question was asked, what about when electric vehicles come on the road and the big new demand for electricity? So let me first of all say, and I can speak with some authority about Britain, our total electricity demand has come down over the last 15 years, and it's come down by about 15%. What's that due to? Energy efficiency gains. So let's not forget, light emitting dimers is the biggest success in terms of the whole renewable sector. So as cities have switched over to light emitting dimers, electricity demand has dropped dramatically. Now I'm going to say something that may seem puzzling. I don't think the total provision of electricity will go up significantly when we've got electric vehicles on the road completely. And the reason I say this is because of the development of intelligent charger facilities for these electric vehicles. You come home, you plug your car into the electricity to power it up. It will only take electricity when the electricity demand across the country at large is low. So you're only charging between 2 o'clock and 5 o'clock in the morning, right? So it will only take electricity, A, when it's not in demand, B, when it's very cheap. So you're flattening demand out through the 24-hour period. Now, this is one of the big advances in going over to electric vehicles.
Did you want to respond, Kevin?
Just very quickly, it might be helpful to know the UK has about 32 million private cars. If they all went electric, you'd have to increase our electricity generation by about 1/3. So for those like numbers, it's about 100 terawatt hours is what you require to power all our current cars. So 1/3 to power the current UK car fleet. But the problem, I think, is actually the building them. The swapping from 32 million petrol and diesel cars to 32 million electric cars still means you get massive queues of cars, big lumps of metal that weigh 2 tons with 70 kilograms of flesh sat behind the wheel, just traveling a few kilometers. We need to move away from cars in our urban environments, whether they're electric or whether they're diesel or petrol. In our urban environments, we need to find different ways of traveling. So I don't think the electric vehicles, the simple swap across them is the right way forward. It locks us in to a very unsustainable set of practices.
Can we now move to Peter Wadham's point on greenhouse gas removal? Dave, Centre for Climate Repair, is that something that falls into the remit?
Well, the Centre of Climate Repair is fully focused on greenhouse gas removal on the one hand, on refreezing the Arctic on the other. So we're developing techniques and technologies in both cases. And what is our objective in terms of greenhouse gas removal? I believe we've got to remove about 30 to 40 billion tons of greenhouse gases a year. And if we do that, we could reach 350 parts per million by the end of the century. This is going to take far too long, which is why we have to buy time by this, sounds like an incredible idea, of refreezing the Arctic and possibly also the Himalayas and other parts of the world where we're losing ice. Here, let me just make a comment. 4 degrees centigrade, forget it. We're never going to get to a world of 4 degrees centigrade with anything like the humanity survival rate that we have today. Remember what I just said, that Vietnam underwater once a year in 30 years' time. Across the water from them, Indonesia, similar. The capital of Indonesia, Jakarta, if any one of you have been there, this wonderful, bustling, modern city, built out of the tiger economy of Indonesia over the last 20 years, will not be livable within the next 5 to 10 years because of frequent flooding. And so Indonesia is now talking about moving its capital to higher land. So what we are talking about is a period when rice production in that part of the world collapses. Once you've been flooded with seawater, that's the end of rice production. It also includes, by the way, Southeast China, flooding of paddy fields massively happening in just 30 years, unless we can manage sea level rise by stopping it happening up in the Arctic Circle region. So we're talking about very urgent problems. There will be no global economy like we know it today once rice production collapses like that. The wealthier of those countries, like China, will be on the global markets. The global markets will shut down. They won't let the export of food happen to that part of the world. That's the way we operate. We operate on a selfish basis. And so we're just going to see the collapse of the global economy well before we hit 4 degrees centigrade.
My name's Anne Johnston and I'm with After the Pandemic. And I mean, we're sitting in here listening to this fascinating discussion. And on the other side of that wall, we've had some 4 and 5-year-old children learning about biodiversity through play. And so my point and question is really picking up on what Jakapita said about awareness and about education. They have been brought here by their school. We've had schools here every day, but that depends on individual teachers. It's not systemic throughout our education system. My 13-year-old daughter is here today as well, and she has not been taught anything about sustainability or the climate crisis in the course of her education, other than from me. And we had the Fridays for Futures March on Friday. Any young children that were there because they were brought by their parents. And again, you know, that those parents are likely to come from a certain socioeconomic group. So given that climate justice and social justice are two sides of the same coin, I'd just like to explore a bit more about what the panel think about how important it is really that education piece is really dealt with in terms of adaptation. Because if we don't do it, if we don't bring it into every single subject that our children learn in school, then we are abdicating responsibility. We're stepping out of that space and we are leaving it wide open for people who maliciously want to come in and misinform and misdirect. That's my view on it, and I would like to hear your thoughts.
My name is Line Niedereggen. I'm from Germany. I'm also with Fridays for Future, but I'm also living in one of the C40 cities, and we keep marching there since 2 years because, and like I'm kind of adding on to your point because what I'm seeing is that I've been brought up in a very highly educated way. I'm studying climate physics, and we've known all these solutions for years now. And there's like people keep telling me, you should become high scientist, whatever, and then you can change the world, you can do engineering and stuff like that. But we keep seeing that like it's going down, it's getting really bad. And there are people fighting at the front of the climate crisis already every day. And people, and like this whole system is built on exploitation of many, many countries in this world. And we keep talking about stuff like I totally agree that we need to remove carbon from the atmosphere. No doubt in that, but it leads to companies saying that we will, we do carbon capturing for 1% of our yearly emissions, but at the same time, we increase our emissions by 3% every year because we need to have this economical growth. And it just, a lot of greenwashing is happening. People have been talking about this at COP in general. What I'm wondering when we speak about like climate adaptation and we keep speaking about the science, I think we really lack of social sciences. How do we actually deal with this as a society, and how do we actually make these changes in our educational system, for example, or also in our society in general, how we deal with politics? Because for me, it's easy to speak about these things because I'm like educated and like have this prestige of studying in Heidelberg and stuff. Then people say that like we are the leaders of climate justice because we mobilize more people, but then like we speak about it as if we're still like 20 years behind. Like we've known this, like we know like we need to switch to renewables, like, but the key is how do we make people actually do that? And that's what I'm wondering. Like, what do you think? That's kind of a question for everyone. How do you think we can actually do this without waiting, without saying, okay, we need to raise education because this will take years, but we need emission reductions now. And we need to do all these social changes as well at the same time. And we need to engineer for carbon capturing and all these things. But we've known all these solutions, and cities and governments are not adapting to it. So where the floods were in Germany, that's actually also where I grew up. It's just a coincidence. I grew up in Erftstadt, which like the picture that was in front page of New York Times. And the people want to rebuild their houses where this river was, because in my whole lifetime, this river never crossed, like it never went over the barrier. So it's not working. People are not listening to the science. We don't understand what we're talking about. And I think what we actually managed a little bit with COVID was that people understood, at least they don't need to understand the whole biology behind it, but they need to understand what are the important numbers and how do we react to the changes. And that has not been happening with climate at all. I would argue that most of the people at COP have no clue what the difference is between emissions and CO2 concentrations.
I'll start. I think these are both just terrific questions. I'll just start with your observation. This is a social science problem. As I've looked at this issue over the years I've been working on it, it's not that we lack the information. It's really a question that I think the human brain isn't particularly well suited for assessing catastrophic risk. We knew a pandemic would come. 1918, we knew there are plenty of reports a pandemic would be here. Did we adequately prepare? No. We know that climate change is afoot, that we're already seeing faster change, but are we acting with the necessary alacrity? No. And there are a number of the social scientists have identified the biases. We're optimists. That's good. It's good to be an optimist. It helps us get through life. That's why in the United States, we have many, many people walking down the aisle at a wedding and saying, "Till death do us part," when we have a 50% divorce rate. So that's optimism. That's helpful. But the optimism hurts us when we're assessing the risk from climate change. We are not accurately looking ahead to the billions of people that will be without food, water, and this very dark picture that's being painted. Hard for us to adjust that. We also rely on recency bias, and that's why all of these codes, building codes, other things look to our past. That's how we judge risk. have we or a close friend experienced the risk? And until we have, we tend to think it won't hit us, won't hit me. I'm an optimist. That's going to hit somebody else in another country somewhere. And until it hits us, only then do we act. And then sometimes, even when you're the victim of flooding, you're going to say it's not going to happen again. It was a freak accident. You're still not going to look at the science. So one way to do that is to force people to exercise their imaginations. And that's why what the UK has done with scenario-based planning for some of our leaders who are in the corporate world is very important. And I will say that we have a lack of climate literacy across the board. And I'll just share with you one study that was done in the United States in 2019 of our Fortune 100 companies. Those are the very largest public companies that we have. And they looked at New York University Stern Business School, looked at the resumes of the 1,188 directors of those corporations. So these are the people who are responsible, have a fiduciary duty for guiding those corporations. When they looked at the ESG credentials, the E, environmental, was almost entirely lacking. Out of those 1,188, only 5 people, not 5%, had any identifiable background in climate or water. And of course, we know water is key. It's the lack of water or too much water with climate change. That tells you that they haven't gotten necessarily the exposure that will help them adequately assess the risks ahead. And that's why it's so important to require some kind of training. And that climate literacy or the lack of education in our schools is very much undermining our ability to make sure that we have the ready task force. But we need to educate our leaders now as well. As you said, we cannot wait entirely until the young people. And how do we do that? I think we do that one place in the financial markets is through regulation, requiring companies to look at their climate risk, both the risk of transition to the bottom line, that is to green energy, as well as the risk of impacts to their operations and their facilities. That, I hope, would drive better assessment of this risk that we all have great difficulty properly judging.
Okay, I think Kevin, you'd like to say a few words.
I'd just like to echo Alice's last comment there, how regulation is absolutely key for educating our governments and our institutions. But going back to, I think, Anne's first point about education, well, certainly we should be having that in the schools. It seems ridiculous to me that it's not an embedded key part of our education systems. That seems strange, and hopefully not in the sort of way that we've been doing for the last 200 years, where we isolate everything off into its different disciplinary silos. We need to recognise what the sorts of challenges that we're facing with 8 to 10 billion people on the planet is that they're much more system oriented. So we need to find ways to cross over the boundaries between disciplines. I think it's one of the reasons we've struggled with climate change. It's the first really big system challenge that we've had to face, and we're realising that we're not really equipped, because we've had 200 years of really very effective reductionism, which has been very good. It has worked well, but it doesn't help us address these sort of system issues. But I'm also going to say that we can't just obviously wait for the children. And I've moved from being healthily skeptical to really hopeful in terms of education after being involved with the Citizens' Assembly in Scotland. I was one of the evidence leads, along with a number of other academics and others, providing evidence to the citizens, who spent 6 months, just 6 months. It was hugely demanding for them. It was hugely demanding for us, trying to provide information by which the citizens could make informed decisions about what we should be doing in government. And they provided that report to the Scottish government. These things have happened in other parts of the world, countries and cities and so forth. And I think there has real scope, quite a short, intense period of understanding the breadth of issues in relation to climate change and broad sustainability issues and fairness and equity and so forth, meant that they could come up with really quite thoughtful, reasoned outputs and guidance to governments. So I think that is one way that we can actually quite rapidly accelerate education into our policy realm. And I personally think it's doing it with citizens and having our governments having to respond to them. We need a stronger mechanism by which governments have to respond and take on board some of the recommendations. We have to think about how that may play out. In the UK, we've got the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill, which is being developed at the moment, and that does include a lot more citizens' assemblies. I think that is really a positive way to get rapid education into informing policy. On Lena's point, The social sciences are important on this, but so are the arts. And I'm saying this as a mechanical engineer who used to design and build offshore oil platforms. So I like spanners and oil. But nevertheless, we know all the tech, we've got all the tech we need. We've got all the science we need to respond from a mitigation point of view to the challenges. As you point out, we're not doing that. We're failing. And why are we failing? I don't know exactly why we're failing, but I think we need multiple narratives, eclectic narratives, diverse narratives from different groups. We have responding to climate change is deeply cultural. So it's not one message. There isn't one message out there. We need multiple ways of engaging. And the sorts of challenges you're pointing out in Namibia will require very different sets of messages and engagement than if you're doing that in some other part of the world where the population might be better educated. No brighter, but certainly better educated. So I think we have to colour our messages and our narratives to the cultural environments we're operating in. We also have to recognise we're not just giving a message, we're also receiving a message. It's an interplay, and that's quite hard for us as academics to realise that. We always like to think that it's knowledge exchange or knowledge transfer, rather. We transfer our knowledge to the little people out there, but actually the little people out there tell us a lot about things that we need to be changing as well and thinking about how we do our own work. So it's an interplay, and I think opening up to the sort of arts and social scientists, to narratives, to stories, to all those other facets, and these will not always be coloured around carbon dioxide and climate change. They'll be talking about some of the broader social issues that bring about those sorts of problems. So I think we don't always colour it in terms of the sort of analytical framing that we use as academics. That's probably unhelpful a lot of time to getting people on board with these issues.
So Dave.
I'm just going to take a rather different angle in response to these two really excellent questions. Yes, social science, critically important. But so is our inherited patterns of behavior, by which I mean the inherited patterns of behavior right across the Western world. And now that we've got, and we all welcome this, I'm sure, the rapidly emerging economies of the world, we see the global middle class, and I'm looking at a gang of middle class people here, the global middle class rapidly expanding far more quickly than the global population. Global population, 6 billion in the year 2000, middle class spending between $10 and $100 a year. We're talking about just over $1 billion, 1/6 of that number. Where are we today? Population going well over 7 billion towards 8 billion, middle class 3 billion. Right, so we've got this very rapid rise in people who are all imitating our behavior. And there's the big challenge. We can't have a planet of middle class people. And yet that's what we would all like to see, because we all want to see them behaving like us. That means, and I agree with your shaking your head at that comment, we have to change our behavior. We are the exemplars and others are trying to imitate us. And so if we are flying around in jets, if we're driving SUVs, if we are consuming the planet, we're setting an example to the emerging global middle class. And what we've got to anticipate then is the kind of disasters that we're now predicting. So I'm afraid this is a really challenging point, that we all imitate others' behavior, and so we're all setting an example to everybody else. But critically important, we set an example, for example, those wonderful films coming out of Hollywood, watched around the world. And everyone says, my God, I want to behave like that. It's pernicious and it spreads terribly. So I think the biggest challenge for us is in our everyday behavior. And if we're going around saying, well, the new middle class is demanding much more meat, which means that the livestock of the world is expanding very rapidly, which it is, and rice production going up, and both of those, beef production in particular, massive increase in methane production, a very, very big greenhouse gas problem. And this is our example that is being followed around the world. We consume far too much meat, right? There's nobody who's living healthily by consuming the vast average that we middle-class people in the West are consuming. So there's all of these behavior patterns. Let's set an example. And that's a very big challenge, I think, to all of us.
I'm Mike Saunders and I run Commonplace, which is a citizen engagement platform for places. And we're running a conversation right now called Rethink Glasgow in partnership with Pooran and after the pandemic. I've got a question about democracy. Top-down leadership is failing on climate. We've talked about middle down in cities and mayors and some of the restrictions that they have. And I wonder whether there's a new role for a kind of invigorated, bottom-up, local democracy, reinvigorated communities coming together to help with this.
Hello, my name's Lorraine Richard-Stones. My question to the panel is twofold. One is, how do we change from a selfish mentality towards an altruistic mentality? And personally, I see that's driven by an obsession almost with gross domestic product, which is basically then driving ever increasing energy use. And unless we fundamentally change those matrices as to what is the measure of success, and also change those behaviours that you were talking about to ones which are more considerate of humanity and our fellow species, we're always going to be in this mess, even though we have the solutions at our hands to actually address them.
I'm not sure we are selfish. We pull out the characteristics in our society that are the selfish characteristics, but we all have within that other elements to how we view the world. Just look how many people responded to the pandemic. Look at what the health workers, the key workers, the people stacking the shelves, driving the delivery vans, the security people, all those other people that put their lives in the risk and actually did die, typically the people who were poor, and often in the UK anyway, often typically people of colour as well. They were being altruistic, So I think we need to recognise we do have those traits. I think one of the problems we've got in us, I'm taking this again, it's a cultural issue from the UK perspective, and certainly some other countries that I'm a bit more familiar with, is that we've eroded any sort of social contract and sense of trust. So I work quite a lot in Sweden, and what I love about working in Sweden, I'm not going to overplay it, level of social contract that is still embedded in their society. They don't even see it anymore. It's been there for about 100 years from the Folkhemmet, as it started off a long time ago, where they trust their agencies, they trust their policymakers. I mean, they disagree with them, and there's skepticism, but there isn't cynicism. I haven't met a not cynical Brit. Brits are all cynical, which is deeply problematic from a political perspective. But I haven't met a cynical Swede. And I think that's because they've got this sense of trust and belief in authorities and the people around them, that they're all trying to do, we may disagree with each other, but we're trying to do our best, we're trying to do good. And I think that's in all of us, or virtually all of us. And I think we need to pull more of that out. But when you've got a deeply polarizing press that is always trying to paint everything black and white, when we've got an economic system which is all about competition and win, 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 all of those bits are the bits that we see. But actually, I think most of us here would like to think we're quite good people. We do care about our friends, our neighbors. We even care about people we don't know. And we need to find ways to pull that out. And perhaps the first comment about how do we reinvigorate our democracies and our local communities, maybe that is, maybe that's where we could start there. We often have much greater trust for people we have familiarity with. So there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest, for instance, like local radio is more trusted than, say, national radio, because people have local accents. They talk about the streets down the road that you recognize. So there's a sense of trust that comes out of familiarity. So maybe that's where we could start, was try to build that trust more locally, and then maybe try to also have a much greater appreciation of other institutions in our society. But that does require our institutions and our leaders to have integrity. And unfortunately, a lot of the ones we've voted in recently, as they jump on a jet from giving a COP26 speech to private jet, to fly to London, to go to a gentleman's club where women aren't allowed to talk to a climate skeptic, that undermines integrity. Thank you, Mr. Johnson.
I will add 2 points. I think the point on GDP is well taken, and certainly at this COP, I've heard far more discussion that is a narrow measurement of the health of the planet and the health of people. So perhaps we will get better at not just looking at whether there's profit, but also what is the cost to the environment, because we're seeing permanent degradation. And as to the point, and they are related, I believe, the democracy point, right now, we're seeing a lot of democracy exercised at the local levels as the people are trying to deal with the impacts that they're suffering. So I think we're seeing some strengthening of democracy there. Academicians, however, and others worry that in the long term, climate change, as these impacts keep rolling in and crises multiply, that it will be a threat to democracy writ large, that populism may grow as xenophobia grows, and that may give more room for autocrats to be able to come in and provide solutions to communities that are suffering greatly from conditions that leave them hungry and poor. We've seen extremists take advantage of the pandemic. In Mexico, the daughters of one of the leaders of the Sinaloa cartel passed out boxes with hand sanitizer and toilet paper and other necessities to recruit and expand territory. We saw that in other places with Islamic extremists. So this is a vulnerable point for any government, and it's particularly vulnerable for democracies that are not responding in an adequate way to take care of their populations, keep themselves safe, keep them thriving. So this is something that we will need to prepare for and look at to make sure that democracy continues to remain strong in the face of warming and rising temperatures.
Okay, I think we have now reached the end of our time. Thanks again for listening. If you are interested to help support this series and help expand the discussion around climate topics, then please do consider backing my channel via Patreon. It will help me produce more content, and you will also gain access to more expert interviews. It would be great to engage more with audiences too and understand your views on these topics.